welcome to RotaRail Tech Series, Episode 3. Don't forget to give us a like and follow our page if you want to keep up with the latest goings on with the RotaRail. Today we're going to talk about ports and port timing. So here you can see the intake port, and the intake port tapers from 50mm down to 45. The reason that it does that on the intakes that billet ink does is that on the face of the sleeve that you put in, it's actually got a groove inside there with an O-ring in it to seal it, so you don't get any water, or reduce the risk of water getting in there. So on these, we've also got a little bit of silicone in there as well, but that's mainly just to seal the outside of the housing. So that's the intakes, and that's how we ran it last season. The 45mm port, it may seem like that's not very big. You can go bigger, you can go 55mm, but it's actually got about the same area through the throat here as like a 2.2 inch intake valve in like an LS engine, and so there's plenty of airflow through that in terms of the area, and in a rotary you also don't have to worry about the air. I'll just put this in here so you can see. You don't have to worry about the air having to get around it. So we just got these housings back, actually, had the exhaust ports done. So you can see here, these are exhaust ports done by Chips Motorsports. They actually take the factory sleeve out, CNC it, the housing, put in a custom sleeve. These ones are titanium, and it eliminates the exhaust gas bypass things, and basically what it means is that there's plenty of meat in the sleeve, so for the size of it. So the ports here, they're about 30mm high and 50 wide, which is pretty close to the same area as the intake, and about twice the area of the factory sleeves that are in there, factory ports. And so if you ported the stock factory sleeve up this high, it's very thin, and then if you get a bit hot, they can actually sag, has happened to people, and so we just felt this was a better way to go. So yeah, just got these back, finished blending them in today. When they come back, they're straight off the CNC, and so these are now ready to assemble the engine. So the other thing to note with the sizes of the ports is that 45mm is about 1500mm squared, the area, and the exhaust's 30 by 50, so about 1500. Now it's a bit rounded off, so it'd be a little bit less than that, maybe 1400 or so, which means we're pretty close to 90-95% exhaust port size to the intake. And typically you'd run a piston engine maybe 70%, 75%, something like that, but when you go with a supercharger, typically you tend to go larger on the exhaust, because you've got the supercharger helping you get air in the engine, but you've got to get it out, and so the larger exhaust port helps with that. So I'll talk a bit about timing. So rotary port timing is kind of a bit of a black art. If you kind of read the specs out there on the web about where the inlet opening and closing and exhaust timing is, basically they measure it on the shaft, and that's kind of a little bit misleading, because this one's doing the intake stroke, but we're actually measuring it off the current one that's at top dead center, basically. And so the numbers aren't really representative of the full amount of duration that you've got on a rotary engine. And this comes back to the volumetric efficiency. And so if you actually look here, we'll just rotate this around. I've just got some tape on here so it doesn't damage it. So if this cylinder is currently on the combustion, so it's fired and the rotor's rotated around, we're just about to open the exhaust port. We all know that the rotor turns at 1/3 the shaft speed. So for 1 full revolution of the shaft, this rotor will turn 1 face. So that means from here until this next apex seal gets round to that port, to the same place, is 360 degrees. And yet here, the exhaust port's still actually open. But the exhaust port doesn't actually close until we go a little bit further, and probably pretty close to 400 degrees. And so this is, so it was 360 here, and this is 400 by the time that this chamber's completely shut off. And the same thing happens on the intake. So what does that mean? It means that effectively, compared to a piston engine, the rotary has about 400 degrees of duration on the intake and exhaust with a peripheral port, which is obviously a lot. Right? And that's the reason that rotaries have, in general, have pretty good volumetric efficiency, but in particular with a peripheral port, it's not unheard of to be, 115, 120% volumetric efficiency or even more. And that's basically, lots of breathing. The reason that a lot of people don't like peripheral ports on a race motor, there's really kind of two things. One is support for the apex seal. I don't really think that's a valid one because the intake port's actually smaller than the exhaust port, and so the seal is more supported on the intake than the exhaust. The other reason is duration, or actually overlap. So here's this chamber currently on the exhaust stroke, and as we come around and the intake port opens, we're already in the overlap here. And so you can see, essentially, there's a huge amount of overlap because this apex seal here has to get to here for 360 degrees on the crank. And so what effectively happens with a peripheral port is that you get a lot of interaction between the intake and the exhaust port. And this is what really puts people off using peripheral port with turbos in particular, is that, this interaction's hard to get right because it affects your intake manifold, your exhaust manifold, the turbo size, all that sort of stuff. And it's also, as you all know, with a peripheral port, like a naturally aspirated one, very poor fuel consumption around town in a daily driver type situation. And the reason for that is that basically with the amount of overlap you've got at low engine speeds, there's a lot of kind of raw fuel basically getting dumped straight out the exhaust. And also very loud because the harmonics between the intake and the exhaust. The reason that we don't think that's going to be such a big deal with the supercharger is that essentially we're not so dependent on the exhaust pulsing. And so basically what we have is, 40, 50, 60 PSI boost. Basically we're using that for scavenging. And so basically we can clear all the burnt, combustion, exhaust basically. Can scavenge it all out of the chamber and out the exhaust. And at higher engine speeds, because this season we'll be turning this to nearly 11,000, we don't think it's really going to impact power negatively. If anything, that sort of RPM, should behave pretty well because that's kind of the sweet spot for a naturally aspirated peripheral port.